the following public debate organized by the Polish Institute of International Affairs Brussels office. I would even add that it's the following public seminar, the 7th, in fact, of our Brussels office, who deals with Russian aggression against Ukraine. And if we add a similar number of debates that had been organized by our headquarters in Warsaw, and also this one in Kiev that was organized in August, when our flagship event, Peace Strategic Arc, had its edition in Kiev, and where our experts were received by President Zelensky. So it all shows our institute's focus on better this war and its outcomes, but also our incessant support for the weaker party of this war, the victim, the side that has been brutally attacked and which has been fighting for its sovereignty for 9 months already. And I'm particularly delighted that we are going to focus today, finally, I would say, precisely on sanctions against Russia. Indeed, the EU, in cooperation with its allies, has imposed the successive packages of unprecedented sanctions in response to this aggression. And the overreaching goal was to punish Russia and limit Russian ability to finance the war and to supply its army. It is worth noting that a huge lesson I also had learned, that the risk of these severe sanctions didn't deter Russia at first place. But after these months, and we are still expecting long-term effects of sanctions, in particular after embargo on Russian oil in the beginning of the next year, but we can already draw several conclusions that have sanctions, for instance, been stopping Russia sufficiently from committing more genocide and humanitarian disaster, or its plans to do so in Ukraine? I'm thinking here about even recent missile attacks on Zaporozhye nuclear plant, and generally constant cutting of Ukrainian society from energy, which will provoke even larger catastrophes during the winter. Another crucial point, how to deal, to counter Russian disinformation campaigns in the EU that are aimed at undermining effectiveness of imposed sanctions. And the other crucial point, how member states and the EU institutions should communicate with our societies, who in reality need to bear all these negative socioeconomic consequences of sanctions, that this price is continuously worth to pay. These, among others, will be the key questions of our today's debate. I don't want to keep you waiting more for our so interesting set of Polish, Ukrainian, and European panelists. And I'm passing the floor to Ms. Barbara Moens, who is a senior trade correspondent of Politico, and who will introduce in more details both our angle of today's discussion and our panelists. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Also, I'm welcoming all our dear panelists, and I wish you all, thank you for coming, all a fruitful and fascinating discussion. Please, have a floor, and the floor is yours. Around.
Thank you for the introduction, and on my part, on my behalf as well, welcome to all of you, also those of you joining virtually, which makes it even easier to follow this debate. As said, I cover trade with Politico here based in Brussels, and that means I have been covering and chasing these different round of sanctions throughout the last couple of months. And as you know, that journalistic work, but also the real work is still ongoing, and we're looking forward to a potential 9 package, including an oil price cap, possibly in the next coming weeks. So we'll discuss that as well. Our today's today's discussion is about the cat and mouse game, so very much about how, what are the effect of these sanctions, how are they enforced, what is the goal, and do they actually achieve the goal that they were entailed to do in the first place. So that is something that I would like to discuss with this panel. First of all, I already apologize for pronouncing these names, as I'm not a Polish native speaker, as you may hear. I'm a Belgian native, one of the few probably in the Brussels European bubble. As said, I'd first like to introduce Mrs. Wisniewska, the most difficult name of all, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Eastern Studies. Then there's Anna Dinner, a Senior Research Fellow at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Her colleague, Mrs. Katza, also a Senior Research Fellow at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And last but not least, Mrs. Teren, who is a Research Fellow here at the European Policy Center. I will first give each of them the floor for about 5 minutes to introduce their specific expertise. After that, we'll have a panel debate among us. And of course, in the end, I would very much like to open the floor to all of you to ask or give you the possibility to ask any questions that you may have. So first, you have the floor to discuss the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy and the energy sector, and then we'll get to all of you.
Thank you very much. In my short presentation, I will concentrate on 3 points. In my short presentation, I will concentrate on 3 points, which are, in my opinion, the crucial for the present situation in Russia. First of all, that economic situation has become a crucial element of Russian propaganda since the invasion. We have to remember that part of the statistical data are not published anymore, and we should be very critical towards others which are still public. What we can observe, the results of these sanctions, first of all, we observe the decline in Russian GDP this year, and probably it will be 3 or maybe 6%. It depends on the oil embargo and price cap mostly, and the scale of this decrease. And what is the most important, that the first time Russia's economy is in crisis when the oil prices are high, from the 60s. Yeah, that's it. And in my opinion, this is present as the power of the sanctions. And when we look, for example, for Russian budget, I think this is the part in which we can observe the negative effects of sanctions. First of all, revenues generated by high gas and oil prices are no longer enough to cover increasing expenditures, budget expenditures. Russia's budget has been in monthly deficit since June. And Russian authorities, to cover their needs, used 3 instruments. First of all, they decided to increase tax burden, especially on the energy sector. Gazprom will have to pay more than 1.2 trillion rubles. It's 1% of Russian GDP additional this year. First block of this money went to the budget in October, and the next 2 blocks we expect in November and December. The second source of funds for the budget is Russian Ministry of Finance is increasing internal debt. Last month, they issued more than 1 trillion rubles public bonds. And it's once again, it's the next 1% of GDP, Russian GDP. Most of these, not most, all of these bonds were bought by Russian state banks for the money which they got from Russian central bank. It means it is just a printing money. And the third source of funds, it is, of course, Russian reserves, money from the national wealth funds. Most of them were frozen by Western countries in March. But thanks to the technical operation between central bank and Ministry of Finance, Russian government still can have access to them. And the last point, it's about energy sector. So far, there has been no decline in oil production. In September, we even observe slight, according to Russian official statistics, I should add. Even we could observe a slight growth, but according to the International Energy Agency, in September there was a decrease in Russian export of oil by 500,000 barrels per day. It's around 7% compared to the before the invasion levels. It's not a huge difference, but we observe change in a direction of Russian export. First of all, the share of EU countries decreased. Now it's around 35% of Russian export. Before the invasion, it was 50%. But what is more important, the share of unknown customers are increasing, and this is this indicates that Russian companies prepare themselves for embargo, for price cap, and they're looking for shadow schemes to circumvent the sanctions. And the last point, it's a situation in Russia gas sector, which has suffered not from Western sanctions, but from counter sanctions of Russian government and Russian gas blackmail. And production of Gazprom decreased by 30% year on year in September, and export of Gazproms outside former Soviet Republic decreased by 70% year on year. The company has a huge problems. Of course, there is no chance to redirect this gas to Asian countries because there is no technical possibility. Thank you.
So much for sharing that. We're going to talk about the impact on the Russian defense sector.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try to focus on military issues as I'm in normal life, I will put it like that. I'm an expert on military issues, not sanctions and such, but I try to do my best. So once more, good morning, everyone. It's good to be here, and I will start with two short lists. First one, Russian military equipment, main battle tanks T-72, T-19, T-80 BWM, with the all variety of modifications. Navigation system for Su-30 and MiG-29 fighters, Iskander-M, Iskander-K, Kh-101, Kh-59, Kalibr cruise missile, missile 9M49, Torem-2 Tornado-S, Orlan unmanned aerial vehicle, and Ka-55 helicopter. And the second list, the US, Japan, Taiwan, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany, Republic of Korea, United Kingdom, Austria, France, Italy. What are in common? That the equipment on those lists of Russian military equipment, the component of that, were found that they are coming directly from those countries from the second list. So, Of course, it's true that the EU and the US imposed sanctions on Russia. They started to impose them in 2014, just after Russia invaded Ukraine and started to occupy Crimea. But nevertheless, during these times, it occurred that still Russia was able to buy those systems, those components in the market from those countries. Some of them try to even cooperate in the shadow sphere. So it's still very important. And what is interesting, ROSI, the British think tank, identified 450 foreign components in Russian military equipment, of which 317 came from EU-based companies. Majority of them were navigation system, optoelectronic systems, devices, microchips, and semiconductors. Then, when we are thinking about, of course, sanctions were imposed on main Russian military companies. However, still, they can cooperate with partners among the world. Moreover, Russia was, and still to some extent, is dependent on Western technologies, but still it's able to produce some military equipment. And we also have to think about additional sanctions, not only connected with some, how to say, very sophisticated electronic devices, but also with something very simple, such as steel and some other components which are, for instance, necessary to being tank shells and all of those equipment which is connected with tanks, military infantry vehicles, and so forth, so on. So, of course, it's true that nowadays we can observe that Russia has returned to Soviet-made ammunition, to Soviet-made missiles, to Soviet-made rockets, but still, which we have to be very careful. It's the first issue is espionage, which is very evident in case of in case of Russia. But the second issue is that we, I mean, both EU/NATO member states, have to think about all of those countries in which we are cooperate with. And when we are selling our electronic components to military equipment, because there were plenty of evidences that Russia was able to buy or to, how to say, to steal those technologies from other countries. So the next step, not only when we are thinking not only about imposing sanctions, is first of all that we have to prevent building new supply chains of military components. Then that we have also to cooperate with our partners. Then we have also to think about how to say, focusing on regular regular buying chains, because some components still can be just bought during through online distribution. Of course, we have to be very precise when we are thinking about our end user certificates, because there are plenty of times when Russia used these false end user certificates. Then still it's very visible that Russia is using third countries for transshipment of the military components. So it's not only thinking about our direct contacts with Russia. And just to sum up, of course, nowadays Russia didn't and doesn't stop producing military equipment. However, the new produced equipment is much worse than those that were produced during last years. So, of course, it's our my last word. It's that it's not only a sanctions; it's also giving a newborn military equipment to Ukraine, which is better than Russian one, which can help Ukrainian to win this war. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much, and I think that very much lay out what the challenges are when it comes to not just sanctions or sanctions enforcement, but also more broader, like you said, in the supply chains and the general trade with Russia. But it does fit very nicely with your subject, the evasion and the circumvention of sanctions. Please go ahead.
Yes. Welcome to everybody here. I will be speaking about the most meaningful practices to circumvent sanctions on Russia as reported by media and watchdogs in open sources and some EU problems on it. And I will start with the oil sector because sanctions in this field are obviously the most important because the sale of oil gives the higher revenue to Russian national budget. And although EU oil embargo and price cap will enter soon, Russian companies have been already concealing the source of the sold oil, and we have noticed many practices in this respect. The reason is that some countries implemented oil embargo, that many companies voluntarily boycotted Russian oil, and many customers prefer to hide the purchase of Russian oil for image reasons or to simply avoid high insurance costs. And so what are the practices? To avoid scrutiny, Russian oil is transshipped at sea, not at ports. And for instance, the tankers can have opaque ownership structure. They can use false registration numbers. They can use false flags. The crews can manipulate location systems to avoid detection of vessels. And the transshipment routes are very diverse, going through, for instance, Black Sea, Mediterranean Sea, near the coast of Malta, Greece, Gibraltar, and also North Central Atlantic. Additionally, Russian crude oil is mixed with other types of crude oil in refined products such as gasoline, chemicals, or diesel. And media, for instance, report cases that Russian oil is refined in Turkey and India and then sold to the EU and United States. More on that you can hear later on from Ivona, which is an expert on energy issues, how the routes go on. Now the other important issue what Anna mentioned is that Russian authorities tries to circumvent sanctions related to all essential components and products which they used to import from Western countries, namely in relation to military sector, high-tech and microelectronics, because the shortages in those products have occurred to be very difficult for them. And they obtain those sanctioned goods primarily through third countries which are not bound by sanctions. And we have a very long list of this club: Turkey, India, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Belarus, Iran, etc. And for instance, the most recent example is that United States sanctioned two companies based in Armenia and Taiwan for illegally procuring microelectronics to Russian company Milandr. And for instance, the financial transfers were made through Swiss company. The practices are very different one. Basically, the most common is to just conclude agreement between Russian companies and companies from third countries, which are only intermediaries of getting stuff and goods from Western countries. The other practice is, for instance, that custom declarations might be falsified by indicating the false customs code. The invoices might be simply falsified, and we have a a huge black market of trading sanctioned goods with well-established routes going through free economic zones worldwide, namely through Dubai, which is the most busy place in this respect. Last but not least, I would like to mention that EU on its own has big problem with enforcing sanctions. On the example of implementing sanctions, harsh trade sanctions on Crimea, in past years, we can see that there were many EU companies breaching or avoiding sanctions. For instance, with the most visible examples of Siemens selling gas turbines through Russian company to Crimea, or Auchan continuing to selling its products over there. And if it comes to current sanctions, I think still this is a case and we have a problem. The example is, for instance, French Total Energies or German BASF selling gas condensate to Russian companies, which might be used to produce jet fuel to planes bombing Ukraine. And for instance, in case of France, there is a legal case towards Total Energies, recently launched by two NGOs over there. And obviously, after Russian invasion, several member states increased the number of legal proceedings, but it is hard to estimate if it is a general trend in the EU, because there is a huge lack of publicly available data on how member states in practice are enforcing sanctions, including concretes. I mean, what are concrete frozen assets frozen by particular member states? What legal proceedings are held? What tools EU member states have and investigative capacities in this respect, etc., etc. The problem is that the member states' practices vary significantly, and even if passing legislation of qualifying infringement of sanctions as EU crime is a good direction, but it will not solve a problem of lack of political will of some of member states to enforce sanctions, because simply to have a legal case, the country has to have good investigative capacities, and to build up such investigative capacities, it needs want to do that. So this is a case in point. To conclude, I would like to say that obviously all practices to circumvent sanctions only to some extent limit the impact of sanctions. And at the end of the day, the sanctions really make Russian authorities a hard life. But anyhow, if we have an option at EU level to close any loopholes, please do that. And I can have two humble recommendations. First of all, in case of investigations, it would be good if EU member states and its allies, namely United States, increase operational cooperation of various services, meaning financial institutions, customs, police, etc., to track circumvention of sanctions, to initiate legal cases, and possibly blacklist the third countries' companies participating in such schemes. And my second recommendation is to the European Commission to increase transparency, because I think that member states should have an obligation to send regular reports on how they are enforcing sanctions to the European Commission, and those reports should be made public to all EU citizens. And also the European Commission could fund some NGOs to track circumvention of sanctions by private companies and EU citizens. All this towards, use more often public blaming and shaming, which in some cases work and in some cases not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's good that you stress that despite all these challenges of enforcement, that of course there is also a very concrete impact of the sanctions as well. And we'll go a little bit more into what the EU can do to close the loopholes a bit later on. But of course, I first give the floor to Mrs. Staran to discuss the EU policy on the sanctions.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the organizing for this important event. I'm from Ukraine, and I would like first of all to say that Ukraine is very grateful for that in response to Russian invasion into Ukraine, EU countries very swiftly, just on the same day, imposed first packages of sanctions and have been able to be united in imposing the next packages. And during these very critically important times of European history. And as EU is the largest trading partner of Russia, it has a very significant leverage in expanding the current sanction regime and in making a sizable income on the Kremlin regime. That is why we do, Ukraine is addressing and appealing to the EU countries for strengthening sanctions, especially amid the current escalation of the war and current terrorist attacks of Russia on our public infrastructure. And so on the one hand, EU has a leverage. On the other hand, EU countries, especially some EU countries, still very much rely on supplies from Russia, such as energy, first of all, energy products, and other products like, for example, semi-finished iron and steel products, like nuclear fuel, like agricultural fertilizers, and other non-ferrous metals, other critical raw materials. And moreover, this dependence it has remained even after the year of 2014, the year when Russia invaded Ukraine and the war has started, and even EU introduced the first sanctions against Russia, but still these dependencies in some countries even were growing. We know these countries. So that is why, but what we have seen that this EU Russia interdependence, like trade interdependence, it failed to prevail Russia from weaponizing its supplies, especially energy supplies, and provoking this like unprecedented energy crisis in Europe. And but still, some EU countries are still like more reluctant to introduce new sanctions and to reduce its dependence on Russian supplies because it brings, like, for them more costs with replacing these Russian products with supplies from the said countries. And but yet, as if EU wants to not want other attempts of weaponization with other supplies, which might happen with Russia, you cannot rely anymore on supplies of critical imports from Russia. And that is why all this EU supply chain should be diversified, and the reliance of one supplier, especially if it's aggressive, unpredictable, and suppliers that were initiating a lot of conflicts which contradicts European values. No, it's it's like it's not in line with the EU policy. It should not be in line with EU policy. Yes, and with should be stopped. And so I hope that there will be some long-term implications for EU policy in terms of, and also for European companies' investment decision in terms of the reconsidering Russia's role in their supply chains, and also in more coordinated policies in reducing and preventing dependencies on one supplier, which is again not reliable, aggressive, and so on. And as to the scope of sanctions, we think that it should be equivalent to the extent of damages and losses and consequences that Russia caused in Ukraine. And again, as war escalates, we have to think how to strengthen the sanctions further, because now we can see that it is not it is not enough to stop Russia from its invasion. So the possible directions for strengthening sanctions, some of them already were mentioned, but I may reiterate. So the first is extending the scope of sanctions to reduce Russian export revenues. According to estimates of Kyiv School of Economics, 40% of Russian imports of EU imports from Russia are still not sanctioned. 40% it already includes all the 8 packages and oil embargo. So with oil embargo, 8 packages, it's 60%, but 40% is still unsanctioned. And there are some room for including more products, more companies to this. For example, like we can say diamonds, they are still not included. And this is an issue here in Belgium because trade in diamonds are not sanctioned at all. And we can see even increasing volumes in diamonds, raw diamonds from Russia to EU after the invasion. In these volumes, I mean not value volumes because of rising prices, but physical volumes, meaning that it's real increase of purchases. And also introducing full embargo on iron and metal products, because for now, yes, some partial embargo was imposed, but this embargo only for finished steel products, and also in the last package, semi-finished steel and iron products were included, but with a very long transition wind down periods. Like, for example, for slabs, it's 2 years. 2 years from now. We don't know what will be in 2 years. Sorry. I mean, we don't know where will be Ukraine, what will be with this war, and so on. We need some to impact now to stop this. Yes, not in postpone in 2 years. So, and some iron and steel products, like for example, cast iron is not even included in this embargo. It is unsanctioned. So Ukraine thinks that we can extend this embargo for all imports from Russia to EU of all metal, iron and steel products. Why? Because it is not like unique products, and it can be replaced from other countries, even from Ukraine partially. Why? Because Ukraine is okay. Before invasion, used to be a big producer and exporters of metal products, including cast iron and also semi-finished iron and steel products. But because of the invasion, and because Russia disrupted two major plants in metallurgical plants in Mariupol, our production capacities has been reduced by 30%, but still we still have a lot of capacities to export and and even to replace Russian products. And if our logistic problems will be resolved again, which we experienced because of Russia blockade of seaports, Ukraine will be able to replace Russian in EU supply chains of this. And also, the second one, the second direction is expanding export control measures. It was said that first of all, I would like to say that according to Kyiv School of Economics, about 55% of EU export to Russia is not yet sanctioned. 55%. So there is a big room for increasing export control sanctions. And also not only for like dual use products and military products, but other products that are important for Russian economy and cannot be replaced very easily. And this is like EU is a major supplier of these products to Russia. And also, the next direction is encouraging more company-level self-sanctions that usually go far beyond country-level compulsory sanctions. And even in unsanctioned sectors that are not cannot be agreed on EU level because of problems with different member states, but companies can self-impose sanctions and do this work and withdraw trade and investment with Russia on their own. I will finish. The next one is preventing sanctions circumvention, which you already covered. So I will be very briefly that again it's addressing loopholes in current sanction regime, especially in military sector, especially because there are still loopholes in this and dual use products. Improving coordination of sanctions implementation at the EU level and among coalition countries, and taking stronger enforcement actions. And also there is maybe a possibility, like another direction is prolonging renewal periods for economic sanctions till. Because now it's sanctions should be renewed every 6 months, and all 27 countries should agree on this, and this actually threatens the EU unanimity, because some EU members can suggest to lift some sanctions or to bargain of so maybe taking into account this historic importance of sanctions and this to end this war, maybe EU should consider this to prolong this renewal, and also maybe even to upgrade its decision making process on sanctions, again to make it more flexible and to make it more to make sanctions more ambitious, because otherwise taking into account all this consensus decision, it, means that some decisions should be compromised and not so ambitious as otherwise. And also, the last point is that yes, as sanctions entail cost for both sides, so it maintaining this EU unity can be very challenging, and but it is very crucial for Ukraine and for creating the conditions to end this war as soon as possible. So so yes, there is a big responsibility for national governments to share this responsibility with the EU for explaining and for addressing its citizens about the reasons and of the sanctions and their impacts and why is it so important and possible implications. And but also it's very important that yes, that EU unity not compromise with ambition of sanctions, because any concessions can only lead to prolongation of this war, which is nobody is interested in. Thank you.
And thank you. And that's what I wanted to ask you as a follow-up, because you mentioned the EU unity. Of course, in the beginning, we had a very swift response. Then there was a lot of discussion about bargaining, negotiation, sanctions fatigue. Do you have a certain disappointment in the EU process when it comes to implementing new sanctions? Now, again, we're talking about a ninth sanctions package. We had the events in Poland. It wasn't enough to proceed with a next sanctions package. Do you feel a certain disappointment, or is that?
Of course, Ukraine is interested in greater coverage and in immediate impact. Yes, that because we mentioned that because of these exemptions, because loopholes, because of without periods, we have the impact of sanctions is just postponed. It will. It can be felt only in maybe in middle. Not now. Not now, but in some like longer term. But Ukraine needs, of course. Ukraine is not interested in continuation of this war, because every day we lose lives, people's lives, and also it's a big damage, economic damage. So no, it's not in our interest at all. So we need EU support, military, financial, economic, and also in sanctions and now. So of course, but I think that that we Kyiv School of Economics, and there are experts that are working on different suggestions how it can be strengthened, on what sanctions should be included in the next package. And I think that EU should balance about satisfying their needs in some critical imports, and trying to sanction Russia, and trying to accelerate the end of this war as soon as possible. So because it's not in EU interest as well to to make it prolong this this war. So that is why maybe other options should be considered in and cutting Russian supplies, maybe it's not so critical for EU and it can be replaced by other countries
Yeah.
import.
All right,
Thank
thank you. I'd like to zoom in a little bit on energy because we have the oil embargo finally, you could say, kicking in, and we have a lot of discussion on the oil price cap. You already mentioned how important the oil is for Russia's economy, and how we risk a lot of circumvention. How can we avoid that? What are your suggestions in these next coming weeks to avoid this scenario?
You know, I think that the whole world. Oh, sorry. I think the whole world is waiting for the 5th of December, and there is big question marks. What will be the effect of embargo and the price cap? Of course, there is no possibility to redirect all Russian oil from EU to Asia and other markets. But of course, in some extent, it's possible. And the question is, what extent? And the question is about the price of the oil after the 5th of November, yeah? Because what we observe in a gas sector, although Gazprom reduced its export, volumes of exports in a huge extent, still can earn much more money than it earned last year. That's why, you know, in this situation, partly Russian oil sector can compensate its losses thanks to the higher prices. But there is no sure. We can't be sure that we should expect growing of prices. That this is, you know, I think. I can't answer the question what will be the effects of it, but definitely what we this shadow, probably you've read about this shadow fleet of tankers which are creating in the world. That last month a lot of tankers were bought by unknown buyers. From Dubai, from Singapore, and others. But this is the question, not only a fleet, because most of these tankers, we are talking about old one. And for example, and the second part of the price cap, it's also a problem of insurance and reinsurance. And this is the question, if we've already heard, even from Turkey, that they are not ready to open Bosphorus for uninsured tankers. And the same is Danish strains. That's why, you know, there is a lot of question marks. That's why very hard to say how it will be introduced. But definitely, you know, we have to prepare also ourselves, investigations of buyers, and we should do everything which and use every instrument we have to protect circumventing. To protect from circumventing by Russian companies these sanctions.
I'm going to ask the mic back. No worries, thank you. Maybe would you like to add something, because especially on the regions that we have to look at, you already mentioned Dubai, you mentioned a couple of as well. How can
but the EU has option to blacklist third countries companies participating in circumventing schemes, and it can, together with United States, just you know, blacklist the same companies to have you know, a mutual reinforcing effort. This might be done, but then you have a problem with countries such as Turkey. You know, they help with a grain deal, and you know, it is quite a difficult case. And I think in this case, the diplomacy should step up, and you know, we have EES here, and also the member states diplomatic corpuses, and this should be part of informal obviously talks with third countries, as in case with India, for instance.
Okay. Yes, of course.
Because there is no, when we are talking about the price cap, there is no sense for China or India pay for Russian oil more than they can pay, that could pay if the price cap is working. Yeah, that's why I can't imagine a situation that India or China will pay much more for the Russian oil than could using the price cap, because they still can because Russia have no other options. Yeah, they are completely dependent now on these countries. And when we are talking about China, I think this is completely out of this game, because most of Russian contracts with Chinese company were signed 10 years ago, and they were signed. Russian companies, Rosneft, first of all, got huge credits from China, which are now repaid by oil export. That's why we even know the real price of this Russian oil exported to China. But in my opinion, it's much less than we will think about the level of price cap will be.
Yeah, that's a challenge. I'll have one more question before I give the floor to the room. Maybe one for you, Mrs. Dinner. You talked about the components from the Russian military equipment, also in the normal supply chains, and how we could tackle this more. Why hasn't that happened yet, and what can the EU do about that? Do you have specific examples? I was wondering.
First of all, is the question of who do we sell our components, and how also EU companies try to avoid those sanctions, because some of them, there were some companies from France, some of them from Italy, some of them some other countries, which still after the embargo, after 2014, try to sell those goods to Russia. So it's one issue. Second issue is that it's a question of thinking of this end user certificate, how to put it into our EU legislation, just to at least try to protect ourselves from selling those or even shifting those components to Russia via brokers, via some very specific components. Elżbieta mentioned this problem with the question how EU sanctioned, not the US, because the US has much more possibilities to sanctions other companies from the third countries. But nevertheless, that I think that we have to cooperate with the US and to use also their tools, because then we will try to avoid those loopholes and to try not to sell those goods to the countries which will sell them to Russia. It's one issue. And second issue is, of course, when we are thinking also about our legislation, about with whom we are trading with, it's a question of the responsibility of the last buyer of our equipment, and it's also a way how do we protect the whole documentation of those military components and military equipment, because it's not only a question about espionage, but it's a question that sometimes, or even very often, Russia was trying to buy just the documentation, not the issues as such. So still, it's a huge job to do, how to protect ourselves when we are selling our goods to the third countries. I know it will be probably very, very difficult, but nevertheless, I think that we have to at least try to do this.
Yeah.
For us as researchers, it is really hard to say how to close loopholes in this field because all the talks are, non-public on those issues. But going through, according to intuition, it would be good if intelligence services and police officers from member states could exchange data, on what Russians are searching for. They're used to, in the past, the public leakages, of a list of items they are looking for on international markets, as published by Politico, as far as I remember. So it is good to have such comprehensive analysis at EU and other allies level, and just put on sanctions list those dual-used the technologies. And if it comes, about the question what else to do, how to strengthen sanctions, from the beginning of a debate on sanctions, I have been working for 15 years on EU affairs, and I see that negotiations on sanctions are terrible. I mean, I really appreciate people who work on that because, finding a common ground between 27 member states is very difficult. I'm coming from a country, frontline country, where children on a playground are playing in a war, with Russians, but imagine that in Belgium you feel safe, and so this is, the different threat perception. But I think that we can have a consensus that we should focus on those sectors which have the greatest revenues for Russian national budget, and definitely we should work on a proper enforcement of oil embargo, and on this operational cooperation. We should think about gas, in the future, gas embargo, to not to have finally free hands, for long term, to not have a comeback, to this dependency. And the third major sector is military sphere, dual-use technologies, high-tech and microelectronic, because if we start the discussions on some minor sectors, it's like very lengthy negotiations. But we have to see the end, final goal. So let's focus on the priorities. Okay, so oil, gas, and military and technology sectors.
Thank you. That's a good sum up. I think I have some more, but I first want to give the opportunity if someone in the room wants to ask a question. Yes, please. If you can just 1 second, then you'll get a mic. And if you could maybe just state your name and maybe the organization that you're.
Okay, Lúcio Vinhas de Souza, ES Strategic Policy, like the colleagues over there. Many thanks for the very impressive discussion. I have one general question and one particular question to Mrs. Staran. My general question is related to how would you assess, because it was a sort of a missing elephant on the room, the level of cooperation that Russia has with the People's Republic of China in terms of implementation of sanctions, and in more terms, in terms of the overall relation that we have between Russia and China, right? So I think that that's something that is strategically extremely relevant for us. Practical question in relation to Mrs. Staran. She made two enticing suggestions for us to encourage, quote unquote, firms to do self-sanction at firm level. In practical terms, how do you see us doing that? What type of actions, what type of instruments you would foresee if we were go down this route? And I extend the same question on your point that we should improve sanctions procedures. Beyond the question of us prolonging the time duration of sanctions, do you have something more precise, more specific in mind? Those would be my two questions.
Thank you. Maybe we can start with the second question for you.
So of questions on self-sanctions. First of all, it's we have a lot of good examples of such self-sanctions that were made by companies on their own because their own values are not in line with what Russia is doing in Ukraine, or because under the public pressure. they care about their reputation and care about their customers, and customers do not support what Russia is doing. That is why they have to impose these self-sanctions, even in sectors that are not sanctioned by government. And and we have this already even in by oil companies, that oil embargo is not yet in place, but oil companies like Sharon, yes, they already did these self-sanctions, and because of public pressure, and quit their withdraw their operations transactions with Russia. How it can be done? No, again, with public pressure. To do this is there are some public databases of companies that watchdogging these companies that still have operations with Russia on Russian market, or no, they are engaged a lot with Russian, and so. To be included in this public database for companies, and this public database is actually prepared by Yale University and also by Kyiv School of Economics. No, Ukraine is also doing this. So being in this database and being watched and being like communicated and no, on the first pages in daily news, it's no, it makes this pressure workable, and so it's like one instrument. The other instrument which is being discussed, that for example, companies that do reject to withdraw its operations with Russia should be obliged to they cannot be no, they can continue their operations, but they should be obliged to make it public that they do have business with Russia. And again, making this information public will draw attention to these companies and will create some public pressure on them. So this is it. And your next question was
the
sorry.
other question was on China and how they, but maybe
okay.
yes.
Yeah, it's very interesting about the China behaving after the invasion, because I think Russia. I'm much more disappointed by Chinese policy after the invasion. Of course, we can see in the last month Chinese export to Russia increased, and it's even higher than it was before the last year. But what we can observe that Chinese companies are ready to export to Russia, first of all, finished goods, consumer goods. There's no problem with smartphones, with cars, and all these stuffs in Russia. But when we are talking about spare parts, investment goods, Chinese companies are not ready they just afraid American secondary sanctions, for example. And this is, I think, for example, spare parts to aircrafts. I haven't heard any information that they decide that there were some circumvention and all this stuff. That's why I think it's working. China as India and as Turkey tries to earn as much as possible on this situation, and they use all opportunity exporting, but as I said, first of all, finishing good. But still, we, as I said, the export increased last month, but still we don't know what was the reason. How part of this increase was connected with volumes of export, and how part was connected with prices, because as we imagine, Russia have to pay for all these goods much more than before the invasion.
Would you like to add, or yeah?
No, I have forgotten about one important issue in terms of recommendations, that we have to finish, with the business connections with Russian businessmen in the EU, and we should, be very persistent in decoupling those connections. And I think that, we have a long list of individuals and companies on EU lists, but still the number of frozen assets is relatively modest, I would say. Because there are many countries in which Russian oligarchs, businessmen invested in real estate, in art, in yachts, etc. And there are only several countries with frozen assets, but the list of countries is very long. I think that Austria, Belgium, Croatia, Cyprus, Finland, France, Greece, Spain, and Netherlands, and Germany and Italy have many assets of Russians, but only some of them have frozen. So there is a scope of maneuver here. And also, for instance, Switzerland has frozen like around 6 billion of euros, but the estimations are that there are much more over there. Obviously, there are many problems because usually money is invested in such sectors when you cannot easily detect the final beneficiary, and there is lots of problems because to detect they just registered through intermediaries, lawyers, accountants, and etc., or through complex shell companies registered in tax havens like Caymans or in Dubai, and you have good financial crimes investigation capacities to detect some, and many member states do not have people, to do that.
And for that, should the Commission put more pressure on member states to do exactly this?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. And it should be and it should be a blaming and shaming because for now, I mean, the European Commission is very nice with member states. We will share good practices, etc. but we need action, not dialogue, because this will not end.
You want to add one more thing, and then we'll go to your question.
I would add one more thing. Ivana mentioned this American secondary sanctions, which regards also military issues, and it's very important because of the fear of that, Chinese companies also limited themselves in selling some military equipment to Russia. So if we as the EU doesn't want to implement and behave in the same way, like putting the secondary sanctions, it probably will be a totally different discussion and not for today. The only issue is to cooperate with the US and to spread our information about some brokers, some countries which are doing the same, and how to say, to use to some extent the US with their options and their secondary sanctions is one issue. And I totally agree with Ella that probably we also have to think about more transparency when we find out such chain of military equipment. We also have to put it publicly, just to also use this blaming and shaming, but also it's a way how can we influence the societies. The more that directly those components are used in items who kill people and in everyday life. So that's the issue.
All right, thank you very much. Gentleman here first was. Could you pass on the mic?
It's working. It's work. Okay. I'm Frederick Molo. I'm a lawyer at the Bar of Brussels and also a jurist. No, it doesn't. Sorry. Yeah.
Still develop your question.
Yeah. So I'm Frederick Molo. I'm a lawyer at the Bar of Brussels and also a research associate at IRIS in Paris. At the beginning. Thank you so much. Better. At the beginning of the invasion, the EU, on par with the US, took the drastic decision to sever the links with the Russian banks with the SWIFT financial mechanism. This decision was supposed to have huge impacts on the Russian economy, but now we didn't hear about it. We hear of volumes of exports between and trade between China and Russia and India and Iran. So could some of you bring some light on the effects of this decision on the Russian economy? Thank you.
It works very good, but we, as a West, limited ourselves, and the SWIFT was only 10 Russian banks. In Russia, we have nowadays something around 300 banks, which still can cooperate with Western world. That's why only part of them are on the lists and covered by sanctions. That's why there is no problem. Even a Gazprom bank, which is partly bank connected with Gazprom, but partly it's a bank connected with a Bank of Russia, which is just a money box of Putin. That's why we limited ourselves a lot. That's why it's working. And when we are talking, for example, about cooperation with China, India, there is a problem with Western currencies because they are toxic for the most of Russian companies. That's why they try to use other currencies. First of all, ruble. When we are talking about cooperation in a post-Soviet region. But for example, in China, there is increase of yuan. And of course, we have still cryptocurrencies. Yeah. And this is the also way how to deal with the financial problems and financial chains.
Right, maybe.
Issue with the introducing SWIFT was the EU legislation gave like a long period of time, like several days for Russian banks. So they prepared, in advance for that. This is not the way of doing with SWIFT. You have to be very quick to produce a chaos over there. And with the EU sanctions, it was like several days given for Russian banks to prepare. But the other issue is, that sanctions on SWIFT, on banning access to SWIFT, you can use other types of communication. The issue is of freezing assets and blacklisting Russian banks. And when you cannot do any financial transaction, this is the meaningful sanctions introduced. But the problem is what Ivona mentioned, that we have not covered all banks by those sanctions. And we see that, for instance, Russians trade in rupees within Indian banks have recently been allowed to do such transactions with Gazprom. So you can see they can go for barter with other countries, etc.
All right, thank you. Very clear answer, I think, to your question. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Robert Strel, I'm a former Polish and a NATO official currently of Płaski Foundation. Thank you for organizing this, because this is an extremely important topic and should be very topical in this town. But the truth is, and it shine through your reactions. It's not. I mean, I'll say it, not just because Madame Mons is on the panel, but Politico is probably doing more to actually highlight the problems than many institutions which are. That's the reality. It's the Brussels bubble at its worst. I kind of agree with almost everything you said. But there's one issue, and I thought I'll disagree, but you started talking about this in a way which perhaps means I also agree. But let me, it's a suggestion. I would like your comment on this. This question of naming and shaming and publicizing. One of the problems is that, apart from all the others, there's no time, is that the issue of sanctions is portrayed almost exclusively in the terms of the factor costs, right? To those countries, in this case, the European Union, others, who imposes. When we talk about the war and the effects it has energy-wise, et cetera, Madam Taran has alluded to this, but it's obviously from a Ukrainian perspective, it all looks very clear. Wouldn't you agree that perhaps, and perhaps you could actually talk a little bit about this, that there needs to be a stronger case made in public, and actually naming and shaming is the right thing to do? Who knows whether the fact that Siemens actually decided to claim that it's going to stop the cooperation with Russia, and by the way, most people were surprised that it still has. We're talking about servicing the Russian energy grid de facto. So wouldn't you say that there are quite a number of arguments, some of them are even economic nature. If somebody wants to, not to prolong the war, wants to actually shorten it, well, actually tightening the sanctions and the implementation is one way of doing this. If you want to talk about decreasing costs, well, punishing the guilty party actually helps. And the third issue related to this, it's not much so far about this, although not enough, but still quite a large number of assets have been frozen, Russian assets, but they have not been released. That's where the low-hanging fruit is. So if I may, sorry, it's slightly long, but I believe it's an important issue. What would be the arguments that you put forward? Because, ethical arguments simply do not work in many places, I'm afraid. But those which appeal to kind of economic benefits, and even those who, want to see the end of the war, to better explain why sanctions actually are an important instrument in doing that. Could I perhaps entice you to say a few more words about this? Thank you.
Maybe you can start on the economic aspect.
I think that what is important, except the moral element, for example, that 20 years and maybe longer, 30 years of existing Russian in a modern way, they exported their way of model of business to Western countries, and we accepted it. They export corruption to us, to corruption, not only economic corruption, they exported political corruption. That's why I think this is the field, this is the level on which we should here in Europe and wider in West discuss when we are talking about Russia and about Russian money. And because, I can understand why City, for example, were ready to accept all Russian money. Not only City, because in Europe also we observe we observed this huge inflow of money. But I think this is the point. First of all, we should now, maybe it's too late because most of this money was laundered very well during the last 20 years. But this is the field, and we should concentrate on the roots of this money.
When we have meetings with business which stayed in Russia, because they are telling us where some companies have left, but we see a business over there. So we are just explaining, how economic terms of conducting business over there are going to be worsen and worsen. And they really fear, about future developments. They are wondering if to leave finally Japan German, French companies, they are wondering. So we are just, telling them about possible scenarios, in
If I may add, when last quarter, Russian consumption decreased by 10%. I think this is the very good point when we are talking about business in Russia. Yeah, there is no demand, and first of all, you have. I can understand why a lot of European Western companies invest in Russia in the beginning of 20s. Yeah, because the risk was very high, but the earns were much higher. Nowadays, the risk are much higher, but the earns which you can get are small. Yeah.
And maybe just the question on the freezing of assets and then releasing them. I don't know if you can elaborate a little bit more on that. We talked about a little bit that not a lot of countries are even seizing the assets, but then nothing happens to the money. So what can we do about that?
There is a EU legislation making easier to confiscate the assets, but generally, as Europol is reporting, generally in the EU member states, the level of confiscating assets in normal crimes is very low, and so you could see that, in terms of confiscating assets of oligarchs, if you have a criminal proceeding, could also be very, very, very low. And the problem is also that member states do not have good investigative capacities in financial crimes, to prove, because you have an oligarch with very good lawyers, okay? And, in cases of sanctions, for instance, related to after Arab Spring, which took place in France, the legal proceedings took several years, so it takes time, and you do not know how many of those proceedings will finish with success.
Yeah.
Story.
Okay, thank you very much. Unless there's one more pressing question, I would like to wrap up there. Thank you for coming. Thank you for organizing, and